What's up, Lego builders? Welcome back to Coconut Brick Studios. I've spent the last year cooking up a secret Lego Star Wars Moc, and it's none other than the Battle of Naboo, an epic showdown between Trade Federation and Gungan armies from Star Wars Episode 1. I finally got to channel my deep and concerning love for Gungans, and in this video, I'll explain why I picked this scene again, and you'll get to see the build process from the first baseplate going down to the final tank being placed. If you're excited, don't forget to execute Order 66 on that like button, and let's get building. We began our journey today with a single gray base plate. Normally, I start a large-scale Moc by laying out all the base plates, connecting them together, then proceeding to build the foundation. But this Moc will be different. I need the base to be modular so I can assemble and disassemble it fairly easily. That means each gray base plate will be built independently of its brethren. Luckily for me, the Battle of Naboo takes place on a flat plane with no tall buildings or complicated structures, so I'm essentially just carpeting each base plate with green plate, then slapping them all together. There will be a little variation though. At one end of the build, we'll sit the edges of a swamp, so certain base plates will have an added layer of dark green plate and tile to represent thicker vegetation and some trans brown tiling creating the swampy water. I started by laying out the shape of the water with filler brick, then went back through covering the middle with dark bluish gray plate. The trans brown tiles are pretty dark, but they're still transparent, so it's important to have the right color underneath. The dark bluish gray provided a nice murky vibe that I felt matched the swamp. I got the idea to build a swampy portion from this Battle of Naboo Moc. I consume Naboo Mocs like some would drink a fine wine or eat a delicious steak, and this particular one built by Mullen Brick was an absolute feast. I'd never thought to add a swamp section, which is what the Gungan army emerges out of on their way to battle the droids in the movie. There's even some ruins like we see in some of the other scenes of that movie, which gave me another idea which I'll talk about later. I went a different route for the execution of my swamp, but wanted to shout out Mullen Brick for the great inspiration. Once the water tiles are all placed, I covered the edges with dark green wedge plate, smoothing out the edges and finalizing the shape of the swamp. There were a couple open patches on the base plates because I built the water portion of the swamp first and wasn't sure how big they'd be, so I left the rest of the base plate empty until I was done. So now I can plate off the rest of it with more dark green plate and tile, since I wanted the swampy vibe to continue past the actual water a good distance. I can't tell you how happy I am with the swamp so far, and it doesn't even have any molded plant pieces yet. For those, I'm starting with the dark green tree leaf pieces that are going to carpet the ground, completing the base layer of plant life. These should blend in with the ground somewhat, but still provide some needed texture and allow for walking. Jungles and swamps are messy, but there is a method to the madness. Certain plants often group together in certain areas depending on the environment, so I'm picking just a few different types and grouping them together depending on where I think they would grow. At this point, I started using other shades of green for the plant life for some much needed contrast because I don't want all the details to disappear in a sea of dark green. Next up are the smaller 3-leaf plants. I like using these along the edges of rivers and pools. It just feels like a water-based plant to me. I'm leaving gaps in between some of the clusters where the Gungans and their mounts trampled the ground, carving out paths as they exited the water. This next plant is the one I was the most excited to use. It's a vibrant shade of green that I pretty much never get to build with and looks like the perfect aquatic plant to go in the water. I've explored many a river and swamp that was guarded by tall fronds and other plants poking out of their liquid home, so I felt some walls of thriving fronds were in order here on Naboo. The last type of plant is the common lily pad. I bought different sizes and tried placing them in a way that looked natural, almost like little docks and jetties cutting out into the water for small creatures to use. One last pop of color will come in the form of an assortment of frogs hanging out on lily pads and rocks. I wanted to include a few Gungans in the water still, so there's this guy who's just about to emerge onto the bank, and then there's this guy who's flexing his hops on us all as he flips into the water. And one last Gungan is just about to vanish out of sight. In order to soften the transition from dense swamp to grassy plain, there's patches of grass grouped around the edge that thins out to studs representing grass as you walk out further onto the plains. I left a crater in one corner which will hold an ancient relic. This statue head is not my design. I found it on a stop motion video forever ago, and unfortunately the video's gone and I can't remember the builder's name, but they did such a good job. It looks just like the ones in the Gungan jungle hideout, and I thought it would be cool to have one slowly being swallowed up by the ground in one corner. To smooth out the hill and the gaps around the head, I'm covering it all with grass, my usual tactic for hiding mistakes and imperfections. After days of work, the swamp is finally done, and I enjoyed working on it so much I'm kinda sad it's all finished. But there's still lots of cool stuff to build. I brought in the rest of the base plates and finished assembling the foundation. The modular nature of this mock has already come in clutch since I've had to clear it off the table completely to film a story for another large mock I'm building, and it was really easy. The next thing on the to-do list is the large plasma shield the gungans use to protect them from the separatist vehicles. It's a thing of beauty and one of the more iconic aspects of the battle, but unfortunately, it's also almost impossible to build in LEGO. However, I've got a plan, and it involves that large crescent shape in the ground and a lot of round green 1x2s. The last time I built the Battle of Naboo, I stacked thousands of trans blue cylinders together, creating a massive blue shield wall. It was cool, but I had no idea how to make it bend while still connected to the ground. Thankfully, I've built a few mocks since then, one of which being the Senate building on Coruscant. I used rounded 1x2s to build its curved walls, and while planning this mock, realized I could use the same technique to make the shield curve across the entire width of the mock. When connected, these 1x2s can bend in just about any shape you need, so I built a long strip and placed it in the crescent-shaped trench in the terrain, which I made using a bunch of green 2x3 wedge plates, tile, and 1x plate. After that, I had the pleasure of stacking over 3,000 blue cylinders, which is about as fun as it sounds. And yet, to my dismay, the worst part of building the shield wasn't even over. Placing the stacks of cylinders was such a pain. These were more finicky than the Jedi Council, and to make matters worse, I didn't account for how heavy they would be when grouped up. They kept tipping over and pulling up the strip of 1x2s, which I had to keep reinforcing as I went along. But eventually, the whole shield was installed and my sanity restored. Somewhat. There is a slight gap between the shield foundation and the green wedge plates in some spots. I was able to fill in portions with green tile, but some places were too narrow for that, so I busted out my LEGO makeup kit and got to work covering things up with grass pieces. Grass work will continue here and there right up until I film the finale, but for now, it's time to move on to the main course of this mini build series. This entire Battle of Naboo mock was brought into existence all because of this next build. When I built my first Battle of Naboo mock back in 2020, it was my very first large-scale LEGO Star Wars mock, and one of my all-time favorite battles in Star Wars, but I've always wanted to return and remaster it one day. There were a couple of things I wanted to improve. Well, mainly one big thing, the famba. I'm no creature builder, and that famba I made was rough, but I knew I didn't have the time or skills to sit around and design what would probably still be a disappointing creature design. Sometimes you just know when a mock is outside of your wheelhouse. Then, back in January of this year, I was on YouTube watching one of Tony Hardy 99's videos where he was going over plans to build Otto Gunga, the underwater home of the Gungans. All of a sudden, this magnificent beast popped up on my screen and I was blown away. I immediately knew it was exactly what I'd been looking for. This famba was designed by Big Judge on Rebrickable, so I bought their instructions and decided this was the year I would redo the Battle of Naboo. As you can see, these magnificent creatures are the perfect centerpiece for my mock, and Big Judge even designed a drum and beam emitter to go on top of them. The beam emitter shoots into the drum, which somehow generates the shield, which then comes down over the army. The Gungans have an interesting mix of advanced and primitive technology. They have plasma shields on giant beasts, but also roll up to battle with wagons pulled by space horses. This particular space horse is called a Falumpa set and was designed by Brick Sheepa. They might be one of the best creature builders I've ever seen and have a website full of instructions you can buy for their awesome builds. I have a link to it in the description of the video if you're interested. I designed the wagon, but used the same yoke technique and wheels as Brick Sheepa because I loved the Gungan vibe they provided. These will be full of large boombas and deployed at the rear of the army to resupply the catapults. Speaking of those, that was another thing I wanted to redo. My old ones were way too big and clunky. I didn't realize, but the actual catapults are a lot smaller than I thought, so I designed a new base to better represent the new scale. The catapults are a goldish color, but none of these pieces exist in that color, so I went with dark tan. The really hard part was trying to figure out how to build the arm/moving portion of the catapult. It looks all bendy and weird, but I eventually realized these reddish-brown dino tails create a similar shape that's strong enough to hold up the launching arm. I got the idea to use this socket piece as the bucket from this Gungan catapult, also designed by Big Judge. I really want to meet this Big Judge someday, because they seem to take their Gungan love as seriously as I do, if not more. The catapults will sit back behind the front lines, launching large boombas at the incoming droid ranks, and based on the movies, those can even take out an AAT, which is pretty impressive. Over the course of my life, I've been blessed to be able to collect every type of Gungan Legos released, even a few they haven't. I created my own tribe of gungans because, well, I'm obsessed. They're a subterranean group that have mastered projectile-based weapons like these handheld Boomba launchers. I have more lore on them, but for now they were recruited by Boss Nass, so you'll see them sprinkled throughout the battlefield. The very front line of the Gungan army is comprised of soldiers bearing plasma shields that can deflect blaster fire. Behind them are the rest of the soldiers throwing Boombas and spears or running up to replace fallen soldiers on the shield line. Most of my Gungans will be at the front, but I sprinkled some throughout the back of the Moc as well to make the army feel bigger. The cavalry rides around on these two-legged Cadu mounts, and this is where Jar Jar and Captain Roos Tarpals find themselves during the battle. I added a few cavalry units behind the front lines, but most of the Cadu are grouped on one side where all the leaders are. Even Big Boss Nass has joined the battle this time with one of his masked advisors in tow. Both these figs are made with official LEGO parts except for Boss Nass's head, and a trio of launcher-wielding Gungans act as the personal guard for the leaders. Now I can just add the rest of the Gungans, making sure to include the dude belting out a fire war call with his giant horn. That's it for my Gungan army, and now it's time for the enemy. We all know and love the classic LEGO droid. It's gotten almost no upgrades, yet has served our Mocs well for years. But a new model has entered the scene, and it has me hooked. These are Clone Army Customs B1 battle droids, and they are so much better. Not only do the legs move, but the wrists can twist as well, and look at the detailing. Plus, each one comes with a backpack, just like the ones we see in Star Wars Phantom Menace. These were just what I needed for my remastered Battle of Naboo Moc, so I went ahead and bought way too many so I could have a massive droid force actually marching towards the shield. Inside the shield, the force has already engaged the Gungans and is getting pelted by Boombas and spears. I found a couple cool pieces that look kind of like exploding Boombas, one stuck to the front of some unlucky clankers. The final piece of the Moc is this beautiful AAT designed by the one and only Mr. Idler. This was the first custom Moc from someone else I ever built, and it's still one of my favorites. The scale is perfect and the level of detail is entrancing. It even has a driver's compartment that can be removed from the rear. I'll have one of these at either edge of the Moc, patiently waiting for the shield to go down so they can begin to hunt. Mist clings to the ground just outside the swamplands of Naboo, swirling and dancing as it's disturbed by the hundreds of Gungans and their war beasts marching out onto the plains. For the first time in years, the Gungan Grand Army has been mobilized in its entirety, tasked with distracting a large droid army in order for Queen Amidala and her guerrilla forces to infiltrate and retake the capital city of Naboo. Knowing they're outnumbered and heavily outgunned, these brave Gungans stand and fight for their planet, hoping their strength can outlast the droid numbers. The first ranks of menacing droids have just marched through the shield, and the Gungans are hitting them with everything they've got. Their plasma Boombas and electric spears are quite effective at knocking out the enemy, but for every droid that goes down, 2 more take its place. As the fighting heats up, the Gungans know they have to protect their shield generators at all costs, because if the shield goes down, they'll be at the mercy of the Separatist tanks. More Gungans emerge from the swamp, hoping to prove themselves and come away from the battle boasting of glorious deeds and, most importantly of all, a victory. Even with how long ago I started building this, and how relatively simple the Moc looks, I barely got everything finished in time for the finale. This is such a minifig intensive Moc, and because there's next to no scenery or large structures, they really have to carry the build and the story. But I was able to amass over 100 Gungans for my army, and I think the military force mustered here looks quite impressive. Even the catapults turned out great, though why they were able to harness the power of plasma, but we're still using technology like this is beyond me. That's like having a sports car and using it to plow a field. The Fambas are definitely the centerpiece of the Moc. I don't think I've ever seen LEGO creatures this big, but also be this detailed and realistic looking. And the shield equipment they carry matches them in detail and beauty. I'm so happy Tony's video led me to Big Judge's creations, or this Moc wouldn't have come to be. I'm sure some, if not most of you, were expecting more from the droid side of things. Initially, I was going to include the MTTs and AATs waiting up on the hill, but I've done that Moc already. In fact, pretty much every Battle of Naboo Moc has followed that same layout, and I wanted to focus more on the actual battle scene, but I'm happy I was able to include at least some of the Separatist vehicles in the form of these AATs. The shield was the big question mark for this project. I knew I wanted to improve on the last design, but wasn't sure how until about a month ago. Even though creating that curved foundation built into the ground took a lot of time, pieces, and effort, it was more than worth it because this finished shield wall looks so good as it curves across the battlefield and creates that needed separation between the Gungan and Separatist armies. With all that said, I think the swamp just might be my favorite part of the Moc. I had so much fun building it, and it's been ages since I got to do a lush, nature-oriented scene, which is my favorite thing to build in LEGO. My only regret is that I didn't make it bigger. I loved getting to lay out the environment and represent different parts with different plants and pieces, even down to building little pools with frogs in them or small backwater channels hidden in the reeds. I've already got plans to save this swamp and really the rest of the terrain to use in another large-scale Moc coming up next year. That brings us to the end of this mini build series and showcase on Naboo. It was a new type of video for me. I've never packed that big of a project before into one video, but I must say, I really enjoyed it. It allowed me to focus more on actually building the Moc and enjoying the process. I hope you enjoyed the story and the little Easter eggs hidden throughout, and let me know in the comments what you think of this new format and what your favorite part of the Moc is in the comments. And until next time, happy building.